Kethvar's compound eyes reflected the dim light of the cantina as he began his tale, each facet holding memories that would haunt him until his natural death cycle completed in another 2 centuries. The reporter adjusted the recording device, noting how the veteran's breathing patterns shifted, a telltale sign of stress in Vorthak physiology. "It began with what we thought was a joke," Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty that had been shattered long ago. The Galactic Council's First Contact Division received a transmission from a small yellow star in the outer spiral arm. Sector designation 471C, nothing remarkable about it. Single habitable planet, barely 3 billion years old, primitive electromagnetic communications leaking into space. He paused, mandibles clicking in what the reporter recognized as the Vorthak equivalent of a bitter smile. The transmission was unusual. It wasn't a response to our standard greeting protocols. It wasn't even directed at us. They were broadcasting to themselves, across their own planet, something they called entertainment. The cantina's atmospheric processors hummed in the background as Kethvar's memory drifted back to that moment in the council chambers. The great domed hall had been filled with representatives from 47 species, each more advanced than these newly discovered humans by several thousand years of technological development. The ethereal collective's representative had been particularly amused, their gaseous forms shimmering with what passed for laughter among their kind. The transmission was a series of moving pictures accompanied by audio, Kethvar continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he'd once used in military briefings. The humans called it a movie. The title, when translated, was Independence Day. We watched with fascination as these primitives depicted an alien invasion of their world. The reporter leaned forward, sensing the importance of this seemingly mundane detail. Around them, other cantina patrons had grown quiet, though they pretended to focus on their own conversations and games. The movie showed the human military being utterly destroyed by superior alien technology, Kethvar said, his forearms gesturing in complex patterns that conveyed both mockery and admiration. Cities turned to glass, millions dead, their primitive aircraft falling from the sky like wounded birds. Standard conquest scenario, exactly what our tactical computers had predicted would happen to them. He drained another cup of coffee, the bitter liquid seeming to steady him for what came next. But, then, the movie continued. The humans didn't surrender. They didn't accept their fate. Instead, they did something that our xenopsychology experts declared impossible. Kethvar's eyes focused on something beyond the cantina walls, beyond the station, beyond the present moment. They adapted. Not just tactically, any species can learn new battle formations or develop countermeasures given time. The humans adapted fundamentally. They took alien technology they couldn't possibly understand and, not only reverse-engineered it in a matter of days, but improved upon it. They turned the invaders' own weapons against them. They found weaknesses in systems that had been perfected over millennia. The reporter's translation device struggled with the emotional undertones in Kethvar's words. Fear, admiration, and something else, something that might have been respect, tinged with horror. The crystalline collective's ambassador laughed, Kethvar continued, his mandibles clicking faster now. She said it was obvious propaganda, wishful thinking by a species too primitive to accept the reality of their situation. The ethereals agreed, no species develops that kind of adaptive capability without millions of years of evolutionary pressure. It was impossible. But, I didn't laugh. The words hung in the recycled air like a confession. Around them, the normal sounds of the cantina seemed muted, as if the station's life support systems were holding their breath. I had studied warfare across 17 different star systems, Kethvar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I had seen species fight extinction with technology 1,000 years more advanced than these humans possessed. I had watched the death throes of civilizations that had mapped the cosmic web when Earth was still cooling from its formation. None of them, not one, had ever conceived of the tactical innovations I saw in that single piece of human entertainment. He gestured to the reporter's recording device with one claw. Turn that off for a moment. The young journalist hesitated, then complied. Kethvar leaned forward, bringing his massive form closer to the table. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of military secrets that could shift the balance of power across the galaxy. The humans in that movie didn't just fight back, he said, his voice so low that even the sensitive audio equipment on nearby tables couldn't pick it up. They used computer viruses as weapons. They coordinated global resistance through primitive communication networks. They employed psychological warfare that was so subtle our own experts missed it entirely. But, most terrifying of all. Cathvar paused, his four eyes checking to ensure no one else was listening. They sacrificed individual units to achieve strategic objectives without hesitation. Not through blind obedience or hive mind compulsion, but through conscious choice. Volunteers. They called them volunteers. The reporter's alien features shifted in confusion. I don't understand. Tactical sacrifice is common in warfare. The Vortak military doctrine includes no. Cathvar's interruption carried absolute finality. You don't understand. In our doctrine, units are sacrificed by command decision. The individual fighters may not even know they're being expended until the moment of their death. It's efficient, clean, militarily sound. His mandibles spread in an expression the reporter had never seen before, a mixture of fear and awe that seemed to transform the veteran's entire bearing. The humans volunteered knowing they would die. They understood the mission, understood the cost, and chose to pay it anyway. Not because they were ordered to, but because they decided it was worth their lives. Cathvar's voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with age. Do you comprehend what that means? Do you understand the psychological profile of a species where individuals will choose certain death for abstract concepts like freedom or the greater good? The reporter gestured for permission to restart the recording. Cathvar nodded, though his posture remained tense. The council's decision was unanimous, he continued in a more normal tone. First contact protocols would be initiated immediately. A diplomatic mission would be dispatched to establish formal relations with these humans. Trade agreements would be negotiated. Cultural exchange programs would be established. It was standard procedure. What the council failed to grasp was that we weren't dealing with a standard species. The atmospheric processors cycled again, carrying with them the faint scent of ozone that reminded Cathvar of the recycled air aboard his former flagship. The memory brought with it the phantom sensation of command chairs designed for his alien physiology, the weight of tactical displays showing fleet positions across multiple star systems. I was assigned as military advisor to the diplomatic mission, he said, his voice taking on the mechanical precision he'd learned in the academy. My role was to assess the humans' defensive capabilities and provide strategic analysis of their potential as either allies or threats. Standard threat assessment protocols for pre-FTL civilizations. The reporter made notes on a device that projected holographic symbols in the air between them. What was your initial evaluation? Cathvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Negligible threat level. Their most advanced weapons were chemical-powered projectile systems and primitive fusion devices. Their spacecraft couldn't even achieve reliable FTL travel, they were using chemical rockets to escape their planetary gravity well. By every metric we used to measure military capability, they ranked somewhere between the stone tool builders of Kepler 442b and the nest weavers of Wolf 359. Below the level where we even bothered to include them in tactical simulations. He paused to order another coffee from the automated service unit, which materialized from the cantina's dispensary system with mechanical efficiency. The bitter aroma seemed to calm him, though his forehands still trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. The diplomatic vessel was a converted science ship, he continued. The Harmonious Exchange, beautiful name for what became the first casualty of the war. Lightly armed, primarily designed for peaceful contact missions. The crew included some of the council's finest xenolinguists, cultural specialists, and trade negotiators. And me. The words carried a weight of responsibility that had never lifted from Cathvar's shoulders. Around them, the cantina's other patrons continued their conversations, unaware they were listening to the prelude of the most significant military catastrophe in galactic history. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, he said, gesturing with his secondary arms while keeping his primary hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Approach Earth's solar system, establish communication through mathematical constants and basic pictographs, demonstrate our peaceful intentions through gift-giving and technological exchange, then, gradually introduce the concept of the broader galactic community. We had done it successfully with over 300 species. The protocol was tested, refined, nearly foolproof. Kethvar's eyes distant as he recalled the briefing sessions aboard the Harmonious Exchange. The ship's conference room had been adapted to accommodate the physiological needs of 6 different species, with atmospheric controls maintaining separate breathing zones and gravity fields adjusted for optimal comfort. The discussions had been academic, theoretical, focused on trade routes and cultural contamination protocols. First Contact Specialist Vexhal was excited, he remembered, mandibles twitching with something that might have been fondness. She had successfully established relations with the hive minds of the Magellanic Clouds, integrated the Crystal Gardens into the galactic economy, even convinced the Void Swimmers to accept trade agreements. She considered humans a relatively straightforward assignment. Poor Vexhal. The reporter noted the shift in tense, the past tense reference that suggested the specialist had not survived whatever followed. What happened when you reached Earth? Kethvar's 4 eyes focused on the recording device, as if speaking directly to future audiences who would hear this account. We followed standard first contact protocols exactly. Approached from the outer edge of the system, transmitted mathematical sequences to demonstrate intelligence, waited for response. Everything proceeded normally for the first 18 hours. Then, we received their reply. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under the shifting weight of his exoskeleton. The memory of that moment was crystalline in its clarity, the bridge of the Harmonious Exchange, the excited chatter of the crew as the translation computers processed the incoming transmission, the moment of absolute silence that followed the first successful translation. They sent us the complete technical specifications for our own ship. The reporter's translation device emitted a small chirp of confusion, struggling with the implications of the statement. I'm sorry, could you clarify? They had analyzed our vessel from their initial sensor readings, Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of impossible fact. Not just the basic configuration or propulsion system, they had deduced the internal layout, crew capacity, defensive capabilities, and power generation systems from passive sensor data collected during our approach. The cantina's background noise seemed to fade as other patrons unconsciously leaned closer, drawn by the veteran's words despite themselves. But that wasn't the remarkable part, Kethvar continued, his mandibles spreading in an expression that conveyed both admiration and terror. The remarkable part was what they included with the technical analysis. Blueprints. Improvement suggestions. Design modifications that would increase our engine's efficiency by 15% and reduce our shield harmonics by almost 30%. They were trying to help us build a better ship. The concept hung in the air like a physical presence, challenging everything the reporter thought they understood about first contact protocols, military strategy, and the basic nature of interspecies relations. Specialist Vexhal was fascinated, Kethvar said, his voice carrying echoes of academic excitement that had long since been replaced by harder knowledge. She interpreted it as an unprecedented demonstration of cooperative intelligence. A species so advanced in theoretical engineering that they could improve our technology without even understanding its basic principles. I was terrified. The admission carried weight that seemed to press against the cantina's atmospheric systems. Around them, the normal sounds of alien conversation and digital entertainment created a backdrop of normalcy that made Kethvar's words seem even more disturbing. Any species capable of that level of analytical capability should have achieved faster than light travel millennia ago, he said, his voice taking on the clipped precision of military briefings. Any species capable of improving our technology from passive sensor readings should have expanded beyond their home system, should have already made contact with the galactic community, should have been mapping interstellar trade routes when their sun was still condensing from cosmic dust. But they hadn't. Kethvar's 4 eyes focused on something beyond the cantina's walls, beyond the present moment, beyond the comfortable illusions that had once defined his understanding of the universe. They were still there, on their single planet, in their single system, with their primitive chemical rockets and their electromagnetic communications, he whispered. Which meant either our analysis was completely wrong, or we were dealing with a species that had chosen to limit itself to one world. The coffee had grown cold between Kethvar's hands, But he continued to grip the cup as if it were an anchor to the present moment. The reporter noticed how the veteran's secondary arms had begun unconsciously tracing defensive patterns in the air muscle memory from battles fought decades ago. The second transmission arrived 6 hours later, HFY continued, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's artificial lighting in fractal patterns. This time, it wasn't technical specifications. It was an invitation. He paused, mandibles clicking in what the reporter had learned to recognize as suppressed emotion. Around them, the normal sounds of the space station continued, atmospheric processors cycling, artificial gravity generators humming, the distant vibration of docking ships. But somehow these sounds seemed to fade when HFY spoke, as if reality itself was listening to his account. They invited us to visit their world. The simplicity of the statement carried implications that made the reporter's translation device struggle with contextual meaning. In galactic history, first contact invitations were formal affairs, carefully negotiated through diplomatic channels, hedged with protocols and safeguards that protected both species from cultural contamination or technological disruption. Not just diplomatic contact, HFY clarified, reading the confusion in the reporter's alien features. They invited our entire crew to visit their planet as guests. They offered to provide cultural guides, educational tours, recreational activities. They suggested we might enjoy what they called tourism. The concept didn't exist in our databases. HFY's forearms gestured in complex patterns that conveyed bewilderment mixed with growing unease. The idea that one species would allow complete strangers unrestricted access to their homeworld purely for the purpose of showing them interesting locations and cultural experiences, it was beyond our conceptual framework. The reporter made notes, capturing not just the words but the emotional undertones that might be lost in pure audio recording. How did the diplomatic team respond? Specialist Vexhal was delighted, HFY said, his voice carrying echoes of academic enthusiasm that had long since been tempered by harsh experience. She interpreted it as evidence of an unusually open and trusting civilization. The xenopsychology team agreed. They theorized that humans had evolved in an environment so secure, so free from existential threats, that they had never developed proper paranoia responses. His mandibles spread in what might have been bitter laughter. They couldn't have been more wrong. The atmospheric processors cycled again, carrying with them recycled air that tasted of metal and artificial preservatives. HFY inhaled deeply, using the pause to gather his thoughts before continuing. We accepted their invitation, naturally. Standard first contact protocols required comprehensive cultural assessment before establishing formal relations. The opportunity to observe human society directly was too valuable to refuse. Besides, what possible threat could they pose? The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself. The reporter noted how other cantina patrons had grown unconsciously quiet, their various forms of entertainment forgotten as they listened to the veteran's account. The humans guided us to a landing site in what they called North America, HFY continued, his voice taking on the formal precision he'd once used in military briefings. A large flat area surrounded by their primitive structures. Thousands of humans had gathered to witness our arrival, more than our xenopsychology team had predicted, but within acceptable parameters for curiosity-driven species. He gestured toward the cantina's main viewport, where the stars wheeled slowly past as the station maintained its orbital position. What we didn't understand was that we weren't just witnessing their curiosity. We were experiencing their first large-scale intelligence-gathering operation. Every human in that crowd was collecting data. The reporter's translation device emitted a small chirp of confusion. I don't understand. Collecting data on what? HFY's four eyes focused on the recording device with an intensity that made the young journalist uncomfortable. On us. On our ship. On our technology, our physiology, our behavioral patterns, our social structures, our communication methods, our decision-making processes. But they weren't scientists or military specialists, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They were civilians. Random individuals who had simply gathered to see something unusual. Children, elderly beings, individuals whose occupations ranged from food preparation to artistic expression to manual labor. And every single one of them was conducting sophisticated analysis. The concept violated so many assumptions about intelligence, education, and specialization that the reporters struggled to process its implications. In every known civilization, technical analysis was the domain of trained specialists. The idea that random civilians could conduct meaningful intelligence gathering was as absurd as expecting random rocks to perform mathematical calculations. Specialist Vexhal was fascinated by their questions, Kethvar said, his voice carrying echoes of the excitement that had once filled the Harmonious Exchange's briefing rooms. They asked about our homeworld's gravity, our dietary requirements, our social structures. Standard cultural exchange inquiries, exactly what the protocols predicted. What she didn't realize was that they were reverse engineering our entire civilization from our answers. Kethvar's secondary arms began tracing defensive patterns again, muscle memory from situations where such patterns had meant the difference between survival and extinction. A human child asked me how fast our ship could travel. Innocent curiosity, I thought. I explained our hyperdrive systems in general terms, mentioned that we had traveled approximately 47 light-years to reach their system. The child thanked me politely and walked away. He paused to signal the service unit for another coffee, though his previous cup remained untouched and cooling between his hands. 6 hours later, their primitive computer networks were filled with detailed discussions of our propulsion technology. Not just speculation, accurate technical analysis. They had deduced our fuel requirements, calculated our maximum range, estimated our ship's mass and power generation capacity. From a casual conversation with a child. The reporter's features betrayed growing unease as the implications became clear. Around them, the cantina's other patrons had abandoned all pretense of their own activities, openly listening to the veteran's account with expressions that ranged from fascination to horror. But that was just the beginning, Kethvar continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had shattered everything he thought he knew about intelligence and civilization. By the end of our first day on Earth, their global communication networks contained complete psychological profiles of our entire crew. Not just basic personality assessments, detailed analysis of our decision-making patterns, our cultural biases, our individual vulnerabilities, our command structure, our probable responses to various scenarios. He gestured toward the cantina's diverse collection of patrons with one claw. Look around you. How many different species do you see? How many years of interaction and cultural exchange did it take for them to understand each other well enough to share the same space peacefully? The reporter followed his gesture, noting the careful distance maintained between certain species, the subtle behavioral modifications each group made to accommodate the others, the complex web of diplomatic protocols that governed even simple social interactions. Decades, the reporter answered. Sometimes centuries. The humans did it in 18 hours. The statement struck the assembled listeners like a physical blow. Conversations at nearby tables stopped entirely as alien minds struggled to process the impossible implications. By the second day, Kethvar continued relentlessly, they were making jokes that demonstrated perfect understanding of Vortak humor patterns. They were preparing food that accommodated the dietary restrictions of species they had never encountered before. They were modifying their architecture to provide comfortable environments for physiologies that violated their basic assumptions about life itself. And they were doing all of this while maintaining perfect camouflage of their analytical capabilities. The reporter's recording device hummed softly in the growing silence, capturing words that would reshape galactic understanding of intelligence and adaptation. How did you discover what they were really doing? Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration mixed with terror. I didn't discover it. They told me. On the third day, a human approached me during what they called a cultural tour. She was young by their standards, engaged in what they called graduate studies in something they termed anthropology. She asked if I would be willing to participate in an academic interview. He paused, her eyes focusing on memories that remained crystalline despite the decades that had passed. I agreed, naturally. Cross-cultural academic exchange was one of our mission objectives. She handed me a data pad containing 47 pages of analysis. Kethvar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the reporter and the cantina's other patrons to strain to hear his words. Complete psychological profiles of our entire crew.
Detailed technical specifications of our ship derived from observation and casual conversation.
Strategic analysis of our probable home fleet composition and deployment patterns.
Economic projections of our civilization's resource requirements and trade capabilities. And, at the bottom, a single question: is our analysis accurate?
The silence that followed was so complete that the reporter could hear the subtle vibrations of the space station's structural supports, the distant whisper of life support systems, the faint electromagnetic hum of communication arrays processing signals from across the galaxy. I read through the entire document, HFY said finally. Every analysis was perfect. Not just accurate, perfect. They had deduced things about our civilization that our own intelligence services hadn't fully understood. They had identified tactical vulnerabilities in our ship design that our engineers had missed. They had developed countermeasures for weapons systems they had never encountered.
In 72 hours.
He reached for his coffee cup with trembling hands, though the liquid had long since grown cold.
I asked her how this was possible.
How a species barely capable of interplanetary flight could conduct analysis that surpassed our most sophisticated intelligence operations. She seemed confused by the question.
HFY's forearms spread in a gesture that conveyed helpless bewilderment.
She explained that observing and understanding other cultures was simply something humans did naturally. She said they had been doing it their entire evolutionary history. She mentioned something called pattern recognition as if it were the most ordinary thing in the universe.
Then, she asked if I wanted to see their preliminary defense plans.
The words hung in the recycled air like an accusation against the fundamental nature of reality itself. Around them, alien beings from dozens of different worlds sat in stunned silence, processing implications that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence, adaptation, and survival.
Defense plans? The reporter managed to ask.
HFY's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Detailed strategies for resisting conquest by a technologically superior force.
Multiple scenarios based on different types of alien technology and tactical doctrine.
Contingency plans for everything from orbital bombardment to ground invasion to cultural subversion. They had been developing them since the moment we arrived. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty that had been shattered and rebuilt multiple times. Not because they considered us enemies, they genuinely seemed to enjoy our company, found our cultural exchanges fascinating, appreciated the gifts we had brought from across the galaxy. But they had prepared to kill us anyway. The statement struck the assembled listeners like a gravitational shockwave, distorting the comfortable assumptions that governed their understanding of civilized behavior. The idea that a species could simultaneously welcome guests and prepare their destruction was so alien that several patrons' translation devices began emitting error signals. The plans were brilliant, HFY continued, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and existential horror. They had identified weaknesses in our ship's design that could be exploited with their primitive technology. They had developed tactics that could neutralize our weapons systems using resources available in any human settlement. They had created contingency strategies that could maintain resistance indefinitely even if their primary military forces were completely destroyed. And they showed me all of it with the same enthusiasm they had shown when explaining their art and music. The reporter struggled to maintain professional composure while processing information that fundamentally challenged the basic assumptions underlying galactic civilization.
What did you do with this information?
HFY's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter.
I transmitted everything to the council immediately. Full tactical assessment, complete intelligence analysis, detailed cultural evaluation.
I recommended that we classify humans as a potential Type 7 threat and establish monitoring stations at the edge of their system.
Type 7?
The reporter's translation device struggled with the military designation. Existential threat to galactic stability, HFY clarified, his voice carrying the weight of classifications that had been developed over millennia of interstellar warfare. Species capable of disrupting the fundamental balance of power between civilizations.
Only 12 species in galactic history had ever achieved that designation.
Now there were 13. He gestured toward the cantina's viewport, where the stars continued their eternal dance, seemingly unaware of the conversations that would reshape the relationship between their children.
The council's response was predictable. They dismissed my assessment as xenophobic paranoia.
They pointed out that humans had shown no aggressive tendencies, had welcomed us as honored guests, had demonstrated remarkable openness and cooperation.
They decided to proceed with formal first contact protocols.
Cathvar's four eyes focused on the recording device with an intensity that seemed to compress the space between past and present.
I requested immediate transfer back to the fleet.
I wanted to be as far from Earth as possible when the humans decided they had learned enough about us.
My request was denied.
The atmospheric processors cycled again, carrying with them the metallic taste of recycled air and the weight of decisions that had shaped the fate of civilizations. Around them, the cantina's patrons sat in contemplative silence, processing revelations that would haunt their dreams and reshape their understanding of what it meant to be intelligent in a universe where humans existed.
How long did it take? The reporter asked quietly.
Cathvar's mandibles spread in an expression that conveyed both admiration and terror.
6 days.
It took them 6 days to decide they had learned everything they needed to know about galactic civilization.
Then, they made their announcement. Cathvar's hands had stopped trembling, the reporter noticed.
When the veteran spoke of the humans' announcement, his voice took on the same steady precision he had once used when coordinating fleet movements across multiple star systems. It was the voice of a military professional recounting tactical data, stripped of emotion because emotion was a luxury that combat commanders could not afford. The announcement came during what they called a press conference, he began, gesturing toward the cantina's communication displays with one secondary arm. A gathering of their information dissemination specialists in a location they designated as the United Nations headquarters.
We attended because Specialist Vexel believed it would provide valuable insight into their social structures.
The reporter noted how Cathvar's mandibles had stopped their nervous clicking, settling into the rigid position that indicated complete focus. Around them, the cantina's other patrons had abandoned all pretense of their own activities, openly gathering closer to listen to the veteran's account. The human who addressed the gathering was their designated leader, a female designated as Secretary General whose role appeared to be coordinating responses between their various tribal groupings. Cathvar paused, for eyes focusing on something beyond the station's walls. She was approximately 47 years old by their standards, with graying hair and what they call laugh lines around her eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother. She began by thanking us for our visit and expressing appreciation for the cultural exchange opportunities we had provided. His voice carried echoes of the formal diplomatic language that had once seemed so civilized, so reasonable.
Standard diplomatic courtesy, exactly what the protocols predicted. Then, she made their announcement. The atmospheric processors seemed to pause in their cycling, as if the station itself was holding its breath.
In the growing silence, Cathvar's words carried with crystalline clarity. She informed the assembled gathering that humanity had decided to decline membership in the Galactic Council. The statement hung in the recycled air like a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that governed interstellar relations. For over 3,000 years, every species that had achieved spaceflight had eventually requested admission to the Council. The idea that a civilization would refuse membership was so unprecedented that most languages lacked words to describe it. But that wasn't the remarkable part, Cathvar continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had shattered his understanding of diplomacy, warfare, and the nature of intelligence itself. The remarkable part was their reasoning. He signaled the service unit for another coffee, though his previous cup still sat untouched between his hands. The simple gesture seemed to ground him in the present moment, providing an anchor against memories that threatened to pull him back into chaos. She explained that humans had conducted extensive analysis of galactic civilization during our visit. They had studied our social structures, our technological development patterns, our economic systems, our military doctrines. Cathvar's mandibles clicked once, a sound like breaking crystal. They had concluded that membership in the Galactic Council would be incompatible with their continued development as a species. The reporter's translation device struggled with the implications, emitting small chirps of confusion as it attempted to process concepts that violated basic assumptions about civilization and progress. Their analysis indicated that galactic civilization had become stagnant, Kethvar explained, his voice taking on the academic tone that specialist Vexel had once used when discussing theoretical xenosociology. They determined that the Council's emphasis on stability and conflict prevention had eliminated the selective pressures necessary for continued evolution and innovation. They said we had become too comfortable. Around them, alien beings from dozens of different worlds shifted uncomfortably in their seats, processing an accusation that struck at the heart of everything they considered civilized behavior. The Galactic Council had brought peace to over 3,000 star systems, eliminated war between species, created the longest period of interstellar stability in recorded history. The Secretary General presented detailed analysis supporting their conclusions. Kethvar continued, his forearms tracing patterns in the air that conveyed both admiration and growing unease.
Economic data showing declining innovation rates across all Council species. Military assessments demonstrating the gradual obsolescence of tactical doctrine.
Social studies indicating increasing cultural homogenization and loss of species-specific identity.
She was polite about it.
She thanked us for demonstrating the logical endpoint of peaceful coexistence and assured us that humans bore no ill will toward galactic civilization. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the assembled listeners to strain forward to hear his words. Then, she explained what they intended to do instead. The silence that followed was so complete that the reporter could hear the distant vibrations of ships docking at the station's outer pylons, the whisper of communication arrays processing signals from across the galaxy, the faint electromagnetic hum of systems that maintained the illusion of safety in the void between stars.
Humanity would remain independent, Kethvar said finally.
They would continue developing their technology, their culture, their understanding of the universe without outside influence or interference. They would explore the galaxy on their own terms, at their own pace, following their own objectives. And, they politely requested that all galactic civilization maintain a minimum distance of 100 light-years from Earth's solar system. The words struck the assembled listeners like a physical blow, challenging fundamental assumptions about sovereignty, territory, and the right of advanced civilizations to guide primitive species toward enlightenment.
100 light-years, the reporter repeated, struggling to process the implications. But, that would isolate them completely.
They would have no access to galactic trade networks, no protection from hostile species, no assistance if they encountered existential threats. Kethvar's mandibles spread in what might have been admiration mixed with terror.
The Secretary General anticipated that concern.
She explained that humanity would handle any threats to their civilization using their own resources and capabilities. Then, she provided examples. The veteran's voice took on the mechanical precision he had once used when briefing the Council's Strategic Planning Committee, stripped of emotion because the facts themselves were more terrifying than any emotional response could convey.
Detailed tactical analysis of how humans would respond to various forms of alien aggression. Defensive strategies that could neutralize orbital bombardment using technology they could manufacture with their existing industrial base. Countermeasures against biological warfare that exploited their species' unusual genetic diversity. Economic warfare protocols that could disrupt galactic trade networks without requiring faster-than-light capability.
She presented these scenarios as academic exercises, intellectual curiosities developed during their analysis of our visit. Kethvar paused to order another coffee, though his previous cups remained untouched and cooling between his hands. The simple gesture provided a moment of normalcy in the midst of revelations that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization.
The Council's representatives were confused, he continued.
They interpreted humanity's presentation as evidence of paranoid delusions brought on by isolation and technological primitivism. The idea that a species would voluntarily choose independence over the benefits of galactic membership seemed to indicate fundamental flaws in their decision-making processes.
Ambassador Thexhan of the Crystalline Collective laughed.
The sound Kethvar made might have been an attempt to imitate that laughter, crystalline notes that had once seemed beautiful but now carried overtones of arrogance and fatal miscalculation. She explained to the Secretary General that humanity's independence was an illusion. No single species could resist the combined military might of the Galactic Council if they chose to enforce compliance. No primitive civilization could develop countermeasures against technology perfected over millions of years of interstellar warfare. She offered humanity one final opportunity to reconsider their decision. Kethvar's four eyes focused on the recording device with an intensity that seemed to compress space and time, bringing the past and present into uncomfortable proximity.
The Secretary-General thanked Ambassador Thexhan for her concern.
She assured the Council that humanity understood the implications of their decision.
She expressed hope that galactic civilization would respect their request for independence.
Then, she said something that changed everything. The atmospheric processors cycled again, carrying with them recycled air that tasted of metal and artificial preservatives. Around them, the cantina's patrons sat in absolute silence, processing words that would reshape their understanding of warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of intelligence itself. She said that humanity sincerely hoped the Council would honor their request, because the alternatives would be unpleasant for everyone involved. The statement hung in the recycled air like a gravitational anomaly, distorting the comfortable assumptions that govern civilized discourse. The idea that a primitive species would threaten the most powerful military alliance in galactic history was so absurd that several patrons' translation devices began emitting error signals. Ambassador Thexhan demanded clarification, Kethvar continued, his voice carrying echoes of the diplomatic protocols that had once seemed so civilized, so reasonable. She wanted to understand exactly what threats humanity believed they could implement against superior alien technology. The Secretary-General smiled. Kethvar's mandibles spread in an expression that conveyed both admiration and existential horror. She explained that humans had identified several vulnerabilities in galactic civilization that could be exploited without requiring faster-than-light travel or advanced weaponry. She began with economics. The veteran's voice took on the academic tone that Specialist Vexel had once used when discussing theoretical trade relationships between primitive and advanced civilizations. Galactic civilization depended on complex supply chains spanning multiple star systems. Rare elements mined in one sector, processed in another, manufactured into finished goods in a third. The entire system relied on predictable transportation schedules and stable political relationships. Humans had identified 17 key choke points where a single disrupted shipment could cascade into system-wide shortages. The reporter struggled to process implications that violated basic assumptions about the security and stability of interstellar civilization. But they couldn't reach those locations. They don't have faster-than-light travel. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. The Secretary-General anticipated that objection. She explained that humans wouldn't need to physically travel to those locations to disrupt them. She had brought visual aids. The veteran gestured toward the cantina's communication displays with one claw, as if the screens might suddenly show the impossible presentations that had paralyzed the Council's Strategic Planning Committee. Detailed analysis of galactic communication networks. Technical specifications for the quantum entanglement arrays that enabled instantaneous information transfer between star systems. Mathematical proofs demonstrating how carefully crafted signals could induce resonance cascades that would disable those arrays permanently. She explained that humans could broadcast those signals using their primitive electromagnetic transmitters. The concept struck the assembled listeners like a physical blow, challenging fundamental assumptions about technological superiority and the relationship between primitive and advanced civilizations. The idea that Stone Age electronics could disrupt quantum communication systems was as absurd as expecting wooden clubs to damage neutronium armor. But quantum entanglement arrays are shielded against electromagnetic interference, the reporter protested. The physics alone should make it impossible, the Secretary-General provided complete mathematical analysis, Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of facts that had shattered the Council's most sophisticated defense theories. Equations demonstrating how specific frequency combinations could exploit previously unknown resonance patterns in quantum field structures. Theoretical proofs that had been verified by their primitive computer systems. She wasn't threatening to damage our technology. She was threatening to improve her understanding of physics until our technology became obsolete. The words hung in the recycled air like an accusation against the fundamental nature of reality itself. Around them, alien beings from dozens of different worlds sat in stunned contemplation, processing revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about science, progress, and the relationship between knowledge and power. The presentation continued for 3 hours, HFY said, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of military briefings delivered under impossible circumstances. Military analysis of how humans could conduct asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. Social studies demonstrating how they could induce political instability in galactic civilization without direct intervention. Economic models showing how they could manipulate interstellar trade networks using only electromagnetic signals and mathematical analysis. Each scenario was more sophisticated than the last. Each countermeasure was more elegant than our best strategic planning could devise. He reached for his coffee cup with hands that had begun trembling again, though whether from memory or caffeine withdrawal the reporter could not determine. At the end of her presentation, the Secretary General made one final request. HFY's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the assembled listeners to strain forward to hear words that would reshape the balance of power between civilizations. She asked the Council to formally acknowledge humanity's right to independence and agree to maintain the requested distance from Earth's solar system. She gave us 72 hours to decide. The silence that followed was so complete that the reporter could hear the subtle harmonics of the station's gravitational systems, the distant whisper of stellar wind against electromagnetic shielding, the faint quantum fluctuations of space itself. What did the Council decide? The reporter asked finally. HFY's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting in patterns that seemed to fracture reality into component wavelengths. The Council decided that humanity had revealed themselves to be an existential threat to galactic stability. The vote was unanimous: humans would be forcibly integrated into galactic civilization or eliminated as a species. Admiral Vorthak was placed in command of the operation. His mandibles spread in an expression that conveyed both professional respect and absolute terror. The greatest military mind in galactic history. The being who had crushed the Void Swimmers' rebellion, integrated the Crystal Gardens through strategic conquest, brought the gaseous collective to heel through superior tactics and overwhelming force. 1,000 ships. 50 different species. Every advanced weapon system developed over 3 million years of interstellar warfare. HFY's voice carried the weight of mathematical certainty that had once seemed as reliable as the fundamental forces of the universe. The humans would be given one final opportunity to surrender. If they refused, their planet would be pacified through minimal force necessary to preserve the species for eventual integration. It was supposed to take 18 hours. The veteran's forearms spread in a gesture that encompassed the entirety of the cantina, the station, the vast gulf of space that separated civilized beings from the monsters that lurked beyond the comfortable boundaries of known space. The war lasted 73 days. The cantina's lighting seemed to dim as HFY spoke of the war's opening moments. Though the reporter knew this was impossible, the station's atmospheric systems maintained constant illumination regardless of the psychological state of its occupants. Yet somehow, the veteran's words carried their own shadows, casting darkness across comfortable assumptions about warfare, technology, and the nature of civilization itself. Admiral Vorthak's fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system precisely 72 hours after the Secretary General's deadline. HFY began, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of after-action reports filed from battlefields scattered across the galaxy. 1,000 ships arranged in perfect formation, heavy cruisers providing fire support, light destroyers screening for fighter attacks, support vessels maintaining communication links across the entire battle group. The reporter noted how the veteran's secondary arms had begun unconsciously tracing fleet movement patterns in the air, muscle memory from command positions where such gestures had coordinated the deaths of millions. The deployment was textbook perfect, HFY continued, mandibles clicking in what might have been professional admiration. Standard siege formation optimized for rapid planetary pacification. Overlapping fields of fire, redundant communication networks, backup command structures designed to maintain operational effectiveness even under massive casualties. We had used the same formation to pacify 47 different worlds. He paused to signal the service unit for another coffee, though his previous cup still sat untouched and cooling between his hands. The gesture provided a moment of normalcy in the midst of revelations that challenged fundamental assumptions about military superiority and technological advantage. Admiral Vorthak transmitted the standard surrender demand through all known communication frequencies, the veteran said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of diplomatic protocols that had once seemed so civilized, so reasonable. Complete cessation of hostilities, immediate submission to Galactic Council authority, full integration into interstellar civilization under supervised transition. The humans had 30 minutes to comply. Around them, the cantina's other patrons had grown completely silent, their various forms of entertainment forgotten as they listened to an account that would reshape their understanding of warfare and the relationship between primitive and advanced civilizations. The response came through their primitive electromagnetic communication systems, Kethvar said, his four eyes focusing on something beyond the station's walls, beyond the present moment, beyond the comfortable illusions that had once defined his understanding of military inevitability. A single transmission, broadcast from their capital city on a frequency so basic that our communication specialists almost missed it entirely. 2 words, try harder. The statement struck the assembled listeners like a gravitational shockwave, challenging everything they thought they knew about rational behavior, military protocol, and the basic instincts for survival that governed all intelligent life. Admiral Vorthak interpreted the response as evidence of psychological breakdown brought on by overwhelming technological disparity, Kethvar explained, his voice carrying echoes of the strategic briefings that had once seemed so logical, so inevitable. Mass delusions were common among primitive species when confronted with the reality of galactic civilization. The standard response was to begin bombardment immediately, before their psychological state could deteriorate further. The Admiral gave the order to commence planetary pacification. Kethvar's mandibles spread in an expression that conveyed both professional respect and existential horror. 47 heavy cruisers opened fire simultaneously. Plasma bombardment designed to disable their primary population centers without causing excessive casualties. Surgical strikes against military installations, communication networks, power generation facilities. The bombardment should have ended human resistance in approximately 6 minutes. He reached for his coffee cup with hands that trembled not from age but from memories of weapons that had reshaped the surface of worlds, of targeting computers that calculated the optimal distribution of death across entire continents. The humans didn't surrender. The words hung in the recycle air like a challenge to the fundamental laws of physics, as impossible as water flowing upward or light bending away from massive objects. They didn't even respond to the bombardment, Kethvar continued, his voice carrying the weight of facts that had shattered the Admiral's understanding of military psychology and the basic instincts that governed all intelligent behavior. Our sensor arrays detected massive secondary explosions as their infrastructure was destroyed, confirmed elimination of their primary military installations, verified the complete disruption of their global communication networks. And then, they began their counterattack. The concept violated so many assumptions about technological hierarchy and military capability that several patrons' translation devices began emitting error signals, struggling to process implications that challenged the basic structure of reality itself. Counterattack, the reporter managed to ask. But their weapons couldn't possibly damage ships designed to withstand. They weren't using weapons, Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had redefined his understanding of warfare, intelligence, and the relationship between technology and tactical innovation. They were using physics. The veteran's forearms gestured in complex patterns that conveyed both admiration and growing terror. Our first indication of their strategy came when the cruiser Inexorable began reporting gravitational anomalies in its vicinity. Minor fluctuations in local spacetime, barely detectable by our most sophisticated sensors. The fluctuations were artificial. Kethvar's compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting in patterns that seemed to fracture time itself, bringing impossible moments from the past into uncomfortable proximity with the present. The humans had been broadcasting specific electromagnetic frequencies toward our fleet positions since the moment we arrived, he explained, his voice taking on the academic tone that specialists had once used when discussing theoretical applications of primitive technology. Not random signals, carefully calculated mathematical sequences designed to induce resonance effects in our ship's gravitational compensation systems. They were using our own technology against us. The concept struck the assembled listeners like a physical blow, challenging fundamental assumptions about technological security and the relationship between primitive and advanced civilizations.
The idea that Stone Age electronics could subvert systems designed by species with millions of years of engineering experience was as absurd as expecting wooden arrows to penetrate neutronium armor.
The inexorable gravitational systems began to malfunction, Cathvar continued, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of damage reports filed from battles that should have been impossible.
Minor instabilities that cascaded into major system failures.
The ship's artificial gravity began fluctuating wildly, creating zones of crushing acceleration followed by periods of complete weightlessness.
The crew was liquefied in approximately 47 seconds.
The clinical description carried weight that pressed against the cantina's atmospheric systems, creating pockets of silence where even the background hum of life support seemed to falter. Admiral Vorthak ordered immediate investigation of the phenomenon, the veteran said, his mandibles clicking in patterns that conveyed both professional respect and absolute terror. Our best technicians concluded that the inexorable had suffered a cascade failure in its primary gravitational generators, a 1 in trillion malfunction that could not possibly be replicated. Then, the cruiser Inevitable began reporting the same anomalies. Cathvar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the assembled listeners to strain forward to hear words that would reshape their understanding of warfare and the nature of intelligence itself.
Followed by the inescapable. Then, the invulnerable.
Then, 17 more ships in perfect sequence, each exactly 11 minutes and 37 seconds after the previous failure.
That's when we realized the humans weren't just using physics. They were rewriting it.
The statement hung in the recycled air like an accusation against the fundamental nature of reality itself, challenging basic assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between primitive and advanced understanding of universal laws. Our science teams conducted emergency analysis of the electromagnetic signals the humans were broadcasting, Cathvar explained, his voice carrying echoes of the academic excitement that had once filled research laboratories before being replaced by existential terror. The mathematical sequences were unlike anything in our databases, not just sophisticated, but fundamentally different from any theoretical framework developed by galactic civilization.
They weren't using our understanding of physics to attack our technology.
They were using a completely different understanding of physics that made our technology obsolete. The reporter struggled to process implications that violated basic assumptions about scientific progress and the universal nature of physical laws.
But physics is physics. The fundamental forces of the universe don't change based on who's observing them.
Cathvar's mandibles spread in what might have been bitter laughter.
That's what we believed. That's what 3 million years of scientific development had taught us.
That's what every species in galactic history had discovered through careful observation and experimentation.
The humans proved us wrong.
His forearms traced patterns in the air that seemed to bend space around them, creating optical illusions that made the cantina's geometry appear unstable. They weren't observing universal laws, they were deriving them from first principles using mathematical frameworks that we had never conceived.
And their mathematics worked better than ours.
The concept struck the assembled listeners like a gravitational collapse, compressing comfortable assumptions about intelligence and progress into dense singularities of impossibility that warped the space around rational thought. Admiral Vorthak ordered immediate withdrawal to minimum safe distance while our science teams attempted to develop countermeasures, Cathvar continued, his voice carrying the weight of tactical decisions that had been made under circumstances that violated every assumption underlying military doctrine. Standard protocol for encountering unknown technology: maintain defensive posture while specialists analyze the threat.
The humans didn't allow us to withdraw.
The veteran's compound eyes focused on the recording device with an intensity that seemed to compress the distance between past and present. As soon as our ships began maneuvering away from Earth, they implemented what they called Plan Beta. Our first indication of their new strategy came when ships throughout the fleet began reporting communication difficulties.
Not system failures, the equipment was functioning perfectly. The signals were simply being redirected.
Cathvar paused to order another coffee, though his previous cups remained untouched and cooling between his hands. The gesture provided an anchor to the present moment, a reminder that some things remained constant even when the universe revealed itself to be fundamentally different from everything he had believed. The humans had learned to manipulate quantum entanglement fields, he said, his voice taking on the academic tone that specialists had once used when discussing theoretical impossibilities that had suddenly become tactical realities.
Not just detect them or interfere with them, actually redirect quantum entangled particles to different destinations without breaking the entanglement.
They were stealing our communications and replacing them with their own. The concept violated so many fundamental principles of quantum physics that several patrons began making gestures that their various species used to ward off impossible things, supernatural phenomena that challenged the basic structure of rational thought. Admiral Vorthak found himself receiving detailed tactical assessments of his own fleet's capabilities, Kethvar continued, his mandibles clicking in what might have been admiration mixed with terror. Complete analysis of our ship's strengths and weaknesses, compiled using information gathered from our own internal communications. Strategic recommendations for how humans could exploit vulnerabilities in our formations that our own tactical computers had failed to identify. The reports were signed by something called the Earth Strategic Command. The veteran's voice carried the weight of revelations that had shattered every assumption underlying galactic military doctrine. At the bottom of each report was a single line: resistance is optimal. Surrender is inefficient. Around them, the cantina's atmospheric system seemed to struggle against the weight of impossible facts, creating subtle pressure variations that made breathing difficult despite optimal environmental controls. The Admiral ordered immediate attack, Kethvar said, his forearms tracing fleet movement patterns that grew increasingly chaotic as he spoke. Full bombardment, maximum intensity, every available weapon system focused on the planet's surface. The objective was no longer pacification, it was sterilization. 900 ships opened fire simultaneously. His voice took on the mechanical precision of targeting computers calculating the optimal distribution of destruction across an entire world. Plasma bombardment sufficient to boil the oceans. Antimatter warheads designed to crack continental plates. Gravitational weapons that could destabilize planetary rotation. Enough firepower to eliminate every trace of human civilization in approximately 18 minutes. The reporter noted how other cantina patrons had begun unconsciously moving away from their table, as if proximity to Kethvar's words might somehow expose them to the impossible events he was describing. The bombardment had no effect. The statement struck the assembled listeners like the collapse of fundamental physical laws, creating a moment of absolute silence where even the background sounds of life support seemed to pause in recognition of impossibility made manifest. Not reduced effect. Not minimal damage. No effect. Kethvar's voice carried the weight of facts that had redefined his understanding of reality itself. Our weapons struck some kind of barrier approximately 200 kilometers above Earth's surface. Not energy shields, we had countermeasures for every known form of defensive technology. This was something else entirely. The humans had weaponized space itself. His mandibles spread in an expression that conveyed both professional admiration and existential horror. They had learned to manipulate the quantum vacuum, creating regions where our weapons simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or deflected, they entered the barrier and never emerged. As if reality had decided our attacks were inconvenient and chose to ignore them. The concept challenged so many fundamental assumptions about physics, technology, and the nature of existence itself that several patrons' translation devices began emitting distress signals, overwhelmed by the impossibility of accurately conveying such violations of natural law. That's when Admiral Vorthak made his final mistake, Kethvar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He ordered close approach for direct assault. If our weapons couldn't penetrate their defenses at range, we would close to point-blank range and overwhelm their barriers through sheer concentration of firepower. The humans had been waiting for exactly that decision. The veteran's four eyes reflected the cantina's lighting in patterns that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of tactical countdowns, bringing impossible moments from the past into terrifying proximity with the present. As our ships approached Earth's orbital space, they activated what they called Plan Gamma. 67 ships simply vanished. The reporter's recording device hummed softly in the growing silence, capturing the veteran's words even as reality itself seemed to bend around their implications. Kethvar sat motionless for several moments, his four eyes reflecting fractal patterns of light that spoke of memories too complex for simple chronological recounting. 67 ships, he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of impossibilities that had become tactical realities. Not destroyed, that would have left debris, energy signatures, some indication of what had happened to them. They simply ceased to exist in our local spacetime. The cantina's atmospheric processors cycled with mechanical precision, maintaining optimal environment controls even as the concepts being discussed challenged the fundamental nature of the reality they were designed to sustain. Our sensor arrays detected massive gravitational distortions at each ship's last known position, HFY continued, his mandibles clicking in patterns that conveyed both professional analysis and existential terror. Localized spacetime curvatures that suggested the formation of temporary wormholes. The humans had somehow learned to manipulate spacetime itself, creating transportation corridors that removed our ships from the battlefield entirely. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The veteran's secondary arms began tracing defensive patterns in the air, muscle memory from situations where such patterns had been the difference between survival and impossible defeat. The terrifying part was what happened next, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 18 hours later, those same 67 ships emerged from hyperspace in the Vega system, approximately 25 light-years from Earth. The statement hung in the recycled air like a violation of causality itself, challenging basic assumptions about faster-than-light travel, navigation, and the relationship between space and time. Impossible, the reporter breathed. Ships can't be transported through hyperspace without their crews initiating the jump sequence. The navigation computers alone require conscious input from the ships were empty, HFY interrupted, his compound eyes focusing on the recording device with an intensity that seemed to compress past and present into a single moment of crystalline impossibility. No crew aboard any vessel. No life signs, no indication that anyone had ever occupied them. Just empty ships drifting in perfect formation around Vega's primary star. With one modification. His voice took on the academic tone that specialists had once used when discussing theoretical applications of technology that shouldn't have existed. Each ship's main computer core contained a single file. A text document written in perfect galactic standard, addressed to the Galactic Council. The reporter leaned forward, sensing the approach of revelations that would reshape understanding of warfare, diplomacy, and the fundamental nature of intelligence itself. The message was signed by the Earth Strategic Command, HFY continued, his voice carrying echoes of diplomatic protocols that had been shattered beyond recognition. It contained detailed technical specifications for the gravitational manipulation technology they had used to transport our ships. Complete mathematical proofs demonstrating how they had achieved faster-than-light travel without using hyperspace engines. And a formal invitation for us to surrender. The concept struck the assembled listeners like the collapse of fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy, technological superiority, and the basic relationship between primitive and advanced civilizations. The invitation was remarkably polite, HFY said, his mandibles spreading in what might have been bitter admiration. They acknowledged that the Galactic Council had acted according to their understanding of appropriate diplomatic protocols. They expressed regret that circumstances had required them to demonstrate their defensive capabilities so dramatically. Then, they explained what would happen if we chose to continue hostilities. The veteran's forearms gestured toward the cantina's viewport, where stars wheeled slowly past in patterns that had once seemed stable, predictable, governed by laws that intelligent beings could understand and exploit. Mathematical analysis demonstrating how they could extend their gravitational manipulation technology to affect entire star systems, he said, his voice carrying the weight of calculations that had redefined the relationship between technology and cosmic scale destruction. Equations proving that they could destabilize stellar fusion processes, redirect asteroid trajectories, manipulate planetary orbits with precision measured in centimeters. They weren't just threatening our ships. They were threatening to rearrange the galaxy itself. Around them, alien beings from dozens of different worlds sat in contemplative silence, processing implications that challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between intelligence and power, between knowledge and cosmic responsibility. Admiral Vorthak ordered immediate consultation with the Council's Strategic Planning Committee, HFY continued, his voice taking on the formal precision of military protocols that had once seemed adequate for governing interstellar warfare. Emergency session, maximum priority, full analysis of the human's capabilities and strategic objectives.
The committee's recommendation was unanimous: immediate tactical withdrawal pending development of appropriate countermeasures. His compound eyes reflected the cantina's lighting in patterns that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of tactical countdowns that had measured the distance between civilization and chaos. The Admiral refused. The words carried weight that pressed against the station's artificial gravity, creating zones of discomfort where even the most sophisticated life support systems seemed inadequate to maintain the illusion of safety. He had commanded fleets across 17 different star systems, Kethvar explained, his voice carrying echoes of professional respect that had been tempered by harsh experience. He had brought the crystalline collective to heal through superior strategy, crushed the void swimmers through tactical innovation, integrated the gaseous collective through overwhelming application of force. He had never retreated from any engagement in over 4 centuries of military service. The veteran paused to reach for his coffee, though the cup trembled in his hands and the liquid had long since grown cold. The gesture provided an anchor to the present moment, a reminder that some things remained constant even when the universe revealed itself to be fundamentally different from everything he had believed. Admiral Vorthak ordered the fleet to maintain position and prepare for extended siege operations, he continued, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of tactical decisions that had been made under circumstances that violated every assumption underlying military doctrine. If the humans could manipulate local spacetime to defend their planet, the fleet would simply wait until their energy reserves were exhausted. Standard siege protocol for dealing with defensive technology of unknown capability. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. The humans anticipated that strategy. The next transmission from Earth contained detailed energy calculations demonstrating that their gravitational manipulation systems drew power directly from their star's fusion processes. They explained that they could maintain their defenses for approximately 11 billion years. The concept violated so many assumptions about energy requirements, power generation, and the basic limitations that govern all known technology that several patrons began making gestures that their various species used when confronted with impossibilities that challenged rational thought. But they offered an alternative, the veteran continued, his voice carrying the weight of diplomatic initiatives that had redefined the relationship between warfare and negotiation. A formal duel between their champion and ours. Single combat to determine the outcome of the conflict according to protocols established by galactic civilization over 3 million years of interstellar warfare. The reporter's translation device struggled with implications that seemed to restore familiar concepts to an increasingly impossible situation. Single combat? That's actually a recognized method for resolving conflicts between civilizations. It's ancient, but legally binding under council law. Kethvar's 4 eyes focused on something beyond the cantina's walls, beyond the present moment, beyond the comfortable assumptions that had once defined his understanding of courage, honor, and the basic nature of combat itself. Admiral Vorthak accepted immediately, he said, his voice carrying echoes of professional confidence that had been shattered by impossible circumstances. He was the finest warrior in galactic history, trained in 17 different combat disciplines, enhanced with the most sophisticated cybernetic augmentations available to military personnel. He had never lost a single combat engagement in over 5 centuries of personal warfare. The veteran's secondary arms began tracing combat patterns in the air, movements that spoke of muscle memory from training sessions conducted in environments that tested the limits of biological and technological enhancement. The duel was conducted according to traditional protocols, Kethvar continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence of combat regulations that had governed single combat between species for millennia. Neutral ground and asteroid approximately halfway between Earth and our fleet position. Standard weapons selection: each combatant could choose any personal armament consistent with their species' natural capabilities. No technological augmentations beyond what was necessary for survival in vacuum. Around them, the cantina's other patrons had grown completely silent, their various forms of entertainment forgotten as they listened to an account of single combat that would determine the fate of civilizations. Admiral Vorthak chose his ceremonial blade, Kethvar said, his mandibles spreading in what might have been pride mixed with growing unease. Monomolecular edge, quantum-stabilized matrix, capable of cutting through any known material in the galaxy. The weapon had been forged on the homeworld of the crystalline collective using techniques perfected over millions of years of metallurgical development. It was a masterpiece of military engineering.
His voice carried the weight of professional admiration for craftsmanship that had been tested in battles across multiple star systems, proven in conflicts that had shaped the balance of power between species. The human champion arrived exactly on schedule, the veteran continued, his 4 eyes reflecting memories that remained crystalline despite the impossibility of their content. Standard atmospheric suit designed for vacuum operations, primitive by our standards but functionally adequate. The being inside appeared to be female by their species' biological classification.